Enter the world of the paranormal,
UFOs,
alien abductions,
ghosts,
out-of-body experiences,
past lives,
distant viewing,
government cover-ups.
Welcome to Sightings on the Radio with your host, Jeff Rense. You can reach Jeff at 1-800-745-6655. Place your calls now. Here's Jeff.
And welcome back to hour number 3, Sightings on the Radio. We're going to spend an hour now with researcher, author, lecturer Kal Korf, whose 2 books have certainly caused a lot of eyebrows to go up and down in the past couple of years. Spaceships of the Pleiades, the Billy Meyer story, quite an expose of the alleged ill-gotten gains and goings-on of the Billy Meyer group over in Switzerland. And certainly, most recently, Roswell, What They Don't Want You to Know, which puts forth the thesis that it was indeed the Project Mogul balloon that went down and builds quite an interesting case for that. We're going to talk tonight about a couple of things. Probably the majority of our time will be spent on the Phoenix Lights issue, which continues to play out. It's pretty much coming to a point of conclusion, at least a significant portion of the events of March 13th. Cal, are you there?
Hello?
Hi, Cal. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Good. I just did you hear the introduction?
Yes, I did, Jeff.
Okay. All right. We're all set. I just wanted to find out from you, and you're digging, and you're on this, I guess, every day, as are a few other researchers, but perhaps none as determined as you to find out what really went on, at least with respect to the majority or one of the primary sightings of March 13th in Phoenix. Where do we stand on that whole issue now? Is it getting close to a resolution, in your opinion?
I believe so. I think probably a more accurate way to put it is that what I'll call the first phase is winding down, and now we're ready for phase 2. And I don't know how this is going to turn out, but if I can give a little background, I think it'll be a little more clear.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Ironically, I just came back from filming a documentary on the Phoenix Lights that the Discovery Channel will be airing in October.
Mm-hmm.
And where it now stands is this. There's been a lot of... to summarize the Phoenix events, it was not a single sole source point UFO experience. What the Phoenix Lights were a hodgepodge of different things. First off, we have to remember that by the time the national media gave it the attention they did in the June and July time frame...
Yeah, it was 3 months later.
Absolutely. And it was local news at the time that it went down on March 13th, but it never really broke outside Arizona until USA Today ran that story. And then the other major media, of course, jumped on the bandwagon. So we have to remember one very important thing, that the main reason there were a lot of witnesses that night is because a lot of people were out looking for Hale-Bopp, which was very bright that night. And when people are out looking in the sky, they will see, things way more than usual. And what we have going on with the Phoenix Lights is a hodgepodge of things. We have, starting around the 8 o'clock time frame in northern Arizona, some descriptions of what were several lights. Others described a V-shaped object that was black. And then others described a black triangle. And then later on, there was a refueling operation that we now know of that involved 5 aircraft. Some people reported that. Then, of course, later on, there were just regular lights reported, single lights. And then finally, around the 10 o'clock time frame, there were these lights that seemingly hovered for several minutes after blinking on, and then, of course, they would fade out. And those lights around 10 o'clock got most of the media coverage because there was a lot of video shot from different witnesses of those lights.
Were people out with video camcorders trying to video the Hale-Bopp comet as well, or did they just happen to run back in and get their camcorders?
It ran all over the spectrum. Some were out there to film Hale-Bopp. Others had heard of the UFO sightings earlier that night because a lot of people called the police and the Air Force.
Right.
And then, of course, there were people who saw something, then went in, got their camera, and was able to set it up in time and start filming. So the Phoenix Lights represent a hodgepodge of events. And like any hodgepodge case, there's not any one single explanation for all the sightings because what was observed by people were different phenomena that night. So the challenge for UFO researchers is to map each report to what phenomenon that we know can explain those, and then if there's anything left over, then we have to take it from there. And in the case of the refueling operation, those sightings have been accounted for.
Now, that would be the number 2 in the sequence you reported to us?
Yes.
Okay, let's take them one at a time and go through them if we can. The first one occurred around 8 p.m., I believe.
Yes, out of northern Arizona, with a trajectory going down through southern Arizona, through Phoenix, and ultimately reports coming as far away as Tucson. Mm-hmm. And it took a couple of hours for these objects to get down to that location. They were going the speed roughly of what, not unlike what aircraft would go. But I'll be very honest with people, and I hope they consider this, especially when those who tend to label me a debunker. I have no explanation at this point in time at all, and I stand by this, and I emphasize that to the Discovery Channel today, for the sightings of the V-shaped craft, or what some people describe as black triangles. Now, I have a hypothesis, which I'd like to come back to a little later, as to what I think they may have been, but at this point in time, they remain genuine UFOs from the standpoint that they remain truly unidentified.
Now, were these the 8 p.m. sightings?
Yes, they were.
Okay, so at 8 o'clock we have a number of reports of anomalous objects, some people saying a V, some people saying a black triangle, but we do have a tracking, a relatively accurate tracking of them traversing quite a distance over a fixed period of time. So that's the 8 p.m. sighting in a nutshell.
Yes, and what's very impressive about these particular reports is something that we seldom see in UFO reports, period. For example, Jeff, if I see a UFO and it's heading east, and you happen to live maybe 50 miles east of me, and if I were to call you on the phone and say, Jeff, guess what? I saw this UFO. It's heading your direction. Go ahead and look out in the sky. Right. The odds are you'd never see it. That's one of the most baffling aspects of UFO reports that the late Dr. Hynek flagged years ago, and that unlike airplane sightings where the object follows a trajectory and you can call your neighbors and say, hey, look out for the plane, and sure enough, here it comes, we don't have that kind of luck when analyzing or studying UFO reports. But in the Phoenix objects, at least the first object reported, this black V or triangle-shaped craft, it had such a consistent trajectory that, unlike most reports, there was that element of predictability. And we know by analyzing 911 recordings and police recordings made of people who called in the sightings, not on the emergency line, and with time and date stamps that were done during the one and only piece of footage that is known to exist of these lights flying in a V formation, that we can construct a timeline and a trajectory, and the objects, of course, headed down in a southern direction once they hit into Arizona, starting up around Kingman, and that pattern stayed consistently throughout until the object was lost altogether. So that's very unusual in UFO reports, and I think it provides some circumstantial evidence to support my hypothesis as to what these objects were, which I'll come back to in a little bit.
Okay, that's incident number 1, 8 o'clock. Okay, number 2?
Okay, during another series of reports, we had formations of lights that were seen in everything from groups of 4 and 5, everything from diamond formations to kind of a half circle or maybe a partial triangle, but distinctly different lights. And I believe, since these are the extreme minority reports, that this was probably that refueling operation that was seen that night. Sometimes during the night, refueling operations tend to emit an extra amount of glow, if you will. There's extra lights that get turned on, things like that. And those reports are consistent with the refueling operation, which at the time when the Air Force announced that they didn't have anything up in the air, that simply wasn't accurate. We know now why Luke Air Force Base initially denied having aircraft up in the air, because there were 2 flight logs total that were kept of all flights.
Yes.
Luke Air Force Base, at the time they were put on the hot seat by the media, only had access to one of the 2 flight logs.
They didn't have the whole second half of the equation to work with, right?
Exactly, and that's why it's unfortunate that they said what they did. They should have known or should have cautioned it by saying, we don't have all the data in, but based on what we know so far, we didn't have anything.
Right. That was a human response, and interpreted in a very human way by the people listening, and many subjective interpretations, some self-serving, some not. But again, you're right. If they had the whole amount of data at their disposal, they would have said certainly something different than they did. What does a refueling operation look like, and what was, in fact, being refueled that night, Cal?
Well, they've been a little hazy on what's been refueled. There's been a couple of different reports. There were certainly A-10s in the air. The problem is that there were several weeks of military exercises going on at the time, and in fact, the last night of the exercises was March 13th, ironically. And that's not a coincidence, which will be obvious in a few minutes here. But the Air Force was busy conducting training maneuvers, targeting maneuvers, and they were doing this for several weeks, and they launched quite a bit of stuff over the 2-week period, and a lot of them did not get reported as UFOs.
Okay.
It really wasn't until this triangle-shaped object showed up that people began to really kind of panic in a reporting sense. The phones began to ring off the hook, and we had quite an exciting event on our hands.
Okay, very good. All right, we're going to take a break and come right back with Kal Korf here talking about the mystery of the Phoenix Lights at Sightings on the Radio.
Welcome back to Sightings on the Radio.
All right, we're talking with author and researcher Kal Korf about the Phoenix Lights episode of last March 13th. The refueling of aircraft at night can throw out quite a different light pattern than the eye would expect to see, because they will apparently light up the area of the refueling connection so the pilots can see and so forth, and I guess that may be accountable for some of this. That would certainly throw off a very strange light glow around two planes that were linked together, I would think.
Yeah, also, since there were 5 aircraft involved in this operation, they would fly in such a way that the normal observer would say that can't be planes, because planes don't piggyback on top of each other.
Oh, are you saying that, and I've seen photos of this, that they can refuel up to 5, say, A-10s simultaneously from one KC-135 tanker?
Well, they can refuel more than one plane at a time, as far as I know, actually is getting done, but it's not uncommon for the planes to...
all be in a little covey, a group right there.
Exactly.
All right, that's interesting. Okay, that's episode number 2, a possible refueling explanation there. Yes, for some of the sightings, and I want to emphasize a very small portion of them. Okay. Certainly not the ones that the media glommed onto, a couple months after the event took place. So now we move basically to 10 o'clock, and what got most of the attention were these videos that were shot by various people of lights that suddenly would blink on, pretty much stay in one place, and then fade out. And we now, I think the evidence is in, the verdict is in, that those lights were flares. And I know that that has received some criticism from some in the UFO field, but those pretty much have been from people that are dwelling on the flare explanation and not taking it in context, because the actual pilots that several of them have been interviewed now that launched flares, they were in A-10s, and it turns out that March 13th, when the incident happened, was the last day of an exercise period that was going on for several weeks, and the reason they didn't say anything at the time is because the very next morning they headed back to their squadron in Maryland and didn't know about this, because it wasn't national news until months later. But since then, several of the pilots have been interviewed. At least one of them, I believe the squadron commander, is in the Discovery documentary, and it does basically prove that those particular sightings were flares. Yeah, I read his interview, by the way.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of several that he's given lately. They've also turned over the flight logs, which Luke did not have at the time, and that they verify that there were flares dropped that night. And for those who think they weren't flares or couldn't be, I'd like to address, if I can, real quickly, some of those arguments and show why, if anything, they indicate they were flares and not the other way around.
Sure. Now, we're talking about the footage that many people may have seen in the Fox documentary, in which you made a brief appearance, along with a few other people, that showed these objects rather equally, if you will, stretched out of the night sky, 4 or 5, I forget, I think 4 of them, and in a slightly descending line. It looked to the casual observer as if it might well be a flare line, just from looking at the video. I think that's what you're alluding to, correct?
Yes, not only that, Jeff, but one of the arguments against flares is that, well, the color's all wrong. The flares are more amber in color, and that's certainly not what the video showed. Well, there's a little-known thing in physics that a lot of people don't account for, actually optical physics, and that is that the candloluminescence power of these flares is 1.8 million candlelight. That's 1,800,000 candles. in power is what each flare is equivalent to. And the fact is that the average camcorder, if it tries to focus on such a light and film it in pitch black dark, is going to have the microprocessor in the camcorder essentially oversaturated, and it doesn't matter what color the light was unless it was red. If it's amber, it's going to show up as white on the video. That's exactly what we see in almost all the videos taken. And I have examined now over a dozen of them, some of the best ones, and I've even examined some control footage of the same flares that were launched, and they appear in the same pattern. In fact, the thing that got me interested in the case to begin with, there were two factors. One is it occurred March 13th, which happened to be my birthday, and my birthday was kind of ruined by all these reports that came in. And secondly, which I didn't appreciate, secondly, I was very curious as to why some people were claiming a V-shaped object when it's obvious by looking at this flare footage there's no V shape there. It's more like an arc.
Yes.
So I thought, well, how do we explain this? Well, it turns out they were two separate incidents, and I think obviously two separate objects, the first of which, the V shapes, remain unidentified. So that dealt with the flare part of it.
Now, there's one other thing about the flares that people have talked about, and that's the fact that, gee, if they were flares, there would have been smoke, and none of the video shows smoke. However, I think there's more to it than that, isn't there?
Yes, there is. That also reminds me of one other argument, too, which is flares would have slowly drifted down. Well, yes and no. Keep in mind that the purpose of a flare is to illuminate and to stay as airborne as long as possible, to illuminate an area as widely as possible. And on a clear night in the Phoenix area, these flares can be seen as far away as 150 miles. The average figure given by the Air Force is about 75 miles, so they're very bright. But the reason the flares hovered basically in one place is because the heat that rose from the flares gets trapped in the parachute that's above them, and it kind of hovers there like a hot air balloon for a while until the flare extinguishes itself. Then, of course, it would, fall away.
So it can actually keep itself aloft by heating its own airfoil, so to speak, and pushing it up.
That is correct. The other thing, too, is that there is one particular video sequence where you do see what appears to be smoke. And most people who have rendered an opinion on this particular case in the UFO field that I've been in correspondence with, at least, have not seen many of the videos, unfortunately. And you can only see what appears to be smoke when the lens itself goes out of focus. It's not visible, certainly, when the lens is in focus. And one of the problems with camcorders is that if people don't manually operate the lens is trying to automatically focus on infinity, which is not possible, and that's why the focus goes in and out on some of these videos.
I see. Interesting.
So we also know, too, that they had to be flares due to process of elimination, if nothing else, and here's why. We now know, but didn't know a while back, that flares were dropped, and unless we want to believe that every single flare failed to ignite that night, which is not the case, otherwise they would have had to have conducted the exercise all over again. If they dropped them exactly at 10 and they're in the right spot and they end up looking like flares and they last as long as one of those flares would last before they, faded out and disappeared, then, of course, that has to tell you that they were definitely flares. The military only ran the exercise once that night because it went off like clockwork, and that, again, was their last night in operation before they headed back to Maryland the next day.
Some people say the flares were on the wrong side of the mountain to have been military in nature. What about that aspect?
Well, it depends on where the observer says that they were standing. We have pinpointed the location of several of the cameras where the military says the flares were, and the flares were definitely towards the Estrella Mountains. They weren't exactly over the clean airspace of the gunnery range, which might explain, I want to emphasize the word might, why the military was a little hesitant to comment on this, because the military is civilly liable in court if they drop flares outside of approved areas, for lack of a better term. Mm-hmm. So that might explain, again, it's only conjecture here as to why they were a little hesitant towards anybody asking about the flares, because they, of course, knew that not all of them were dropped cleanly, although the way they were dropped out of the plane was nice and neat, but the actual location was not by the book, so to speak.
Okay.
So that
all right, we have music coming up, Cal. Hang on, we're going to take a break and come back. So we're laying out a pretty logical scenario here so far. We'll see where it goes with researcher Kal Korf here at Sightings on the Radio as we continue right after this.
Welcome back to Sightings on the Radio. You can reach Jeff live at 1-800-745-6655.
And your calls are welcome for Kal Korf. We're talking about the Phoenix Lights. Cal, there is a problem with this whole episode that is not going to be put to rest easily, and that is the reporting by a number of people of lights seen very low to the ground at some distance. Some were videotaped. I know Bill Hamilton talks about this. The lights were seen to move in anomalous ways, again, rather close to the ground I forget the distance, so I don't want to quote it, but they were supposedly seen by 2 or 3 people simultaneously as well. Any take on that from your perspective?
Well, no, because we're still sorting out the what I call the miscellaneous reports of one light here, one light there. What we haven't seen is a clear connection between those objects and either the V-shaped craft earlier.
Okay. I don't think anybody would make that contention either, that there's a connection necessarily, but there are other lights that were sighted that night which are not explicable to my satisfaction yet. So go ahead.
Yes, and we're still trying to run some of those down. We have to keep in mind, too, that some of the witnesses have changed their story. I was down in Southern California last week filming a TV show, and I talked to several witnesses, and unbeknownst to them, I had spoken to a couple of them earlier using a different name, because sometimes, unfortunately, I have to use different names because my reputation or perceived reputation sometimes precedes me. And I noticed that their stories have become much more elaborate. There's also been some people who are from New York that have jumped on the bandwagon who weren't witnesses at all, but they managed to get their stories in the press nonetheless. I have finished viewing videotapes of pretty much all the local coverage that went on in the Phoenix area, and there was one story in particular where the camera crew went in to film a room full of witnesses. And since I know a lot of the UFO people who are the main people in the UFO field, I noticed that at least half the people in that room were not witnesses but fellow UFO researchers. So there's been a lot of inaccurate reporting, is a good way to put it, on what's been going on, but we are trying to run down the miscellaneous sightings as well because, obviously they need to be researched as thoroughly as possible.
Okay. All right. Anything else to add for the nighttime sightings? You want to get back to your original V triangle hypothesis at some point?
Yes. I really don't have anything further to add except I would like to stress to people that as far as the 10 o'clock reports go, which were the ones, unfortunately, that got most of the attention by the media, and that's unfortunate because they turn out to be flares, I want to emphasize that those are a distinctly different set of objects than the earlier ones reported around 8 o'clock of this V-shape or triangle-shaped object. And if I can, I'd like to get onto that right now as to what we're doing about it.
Right, go ahead.
Okay. Well, one of the things as a UFO researcher that has puzzled me and also disturbed me over the last few years is this increasing trend of UFO reports showing these black triangles. I know as a former senior systems analyst at Lawrence Livermore Laboratory who worked on the Star Wars program, I know for a fact that our government has been making these types of triangles for many years now. They are still classified. An example of that is the non-existent, existent Aurora spy aircraft. For those of you who think the SR-71 Blackbird is the most state-of-the-art craft out there, it's not. It's old news, and it's been old news for a long time.
Okay, now you just said a couple things. I don't think anybody's going to take the Aurora and confuse it with a report of a black triangle. That's not the same item. When you talk about the government's been making triangles for years, this is classified information that you have access to. What do you base that statement on?
Well, it is and it isn't. If you start talking to people who still work at Lockheed, at Martin Marietta, even at McDonnell Douglas, and even at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, there are several engineers who are going on record now who have admitted to either working on these types of programs or they certainly admit that they exist. In fact, Aviation Week and Space Technology magazine, in a June issue, I believe it was around, I think, June 24th, if I'm not mistaken, mentioned for the first time, June 2nd, I'm sorry, the existence of these vehicles. In fact, on one of the pages, because they stress how these vehicles are unmanned, on page 51, there's 6 different shapes that they mention in Aviation Week.
They're drawings, right?
They're drawings.
Mm-hmm.
Shape number 4 is a flying saucer. And you have the recent admission by the CIA through a study that was recently released through a historian for the National Reconnaissance Organization, an admission that the U.S. government did cause as many as perhaps 50% of a lot of the Blue Book unknowns from the 50s and 60s that involved these types of vehicles, with the SR-71 at that time in the early 60s being one of the early wing-shaped objects that the government had built for spy purposes. And of course,
there are a lot of people who are scoffing at that, but certainly there is a percentage involved there. Whatever it is, nobody knows. Nobody will ever know. 50%, 25%. But the point is, the government, through that report, the CIA was claiming that U-2s were painted black, some were silver, and so forth, causing real problems on the ground with the observations of what were perceived to be very strange objects. But the question comes back: how can U-2s make right-angle turns and exert 8 to 10 Gs on a pilot without disintegrating? That was the other problem that most people had with that CIA report.
And it's a very valid issue to flag, and certainly the CIA report does not explain those types of incidents. In fact, I checked with the Air Force and found out through somebody there that the CIA report was not only too broad and sweeping, but it seemed to account for most of the reports where there were radar trackings as opposed to sightings.
Understand, right.
High objects at very fast speeds without these incredible aerobatic maneuvers you're describing. Also, this does not explain, of course, those reports of saucer-shaped craft at close proximity. So we find that when we research the issue of the black triangles, we find out that as early as 1970, the government was making some prototypes of this. In fact, in the 1967, there was the Ariane Corporation made basically what was called a Dynair ship using Martin Marietta lifting body aerodynamics. And in January of 1990, there was a patent issued for this type of craft. Now, keep in mind that it takes a number of years for a patent to be granted, and that patent, 4896160, was secured by William Miller of the Ariane Corporation. And let me read to you real quickly the dimensions of this thing, because it's mind-boggling.
Okay.
It says here that the vehicle has a minimum of 1,500 feet in length, 800 feet wide, 200 feet thick, with a payload in excess of 500 tons. It consists of what is believed to be a honeycomb sandwich design using evacuated hull technology, and it has anywhere from 8 to 12 turbofan jet engines buried deep within the hull, and it runs almost completely silent.
All right, now this is a really critically important information. Where did this information come from again, Cal?
This information came from a technical illustrator who worked on some of this stuff, and he had written the Air Force for their comment on this because he kept getting a lot of reports from people he knew in the industry that worked on these projects. He believes, as do I, that some of these vehicles account for some of these black triangles.
I want you to, yes, this is I've never heard this before, and you've got the patent. I want you to read to us once again what you just read from the patent itself about the size of these objects.
Well, this is patent number 4896160, so anybody can check it. It was granted in January of 1990, and the patent was secured by William M. Miller of Ariane Corporation for what was deemed as a bistatic radar surveillance platform. And the dimensions on this was that it was a minimum of 1,500 feet in length, 800 feet wide, about 200 feet thick, with a payload in excess of 500 tons.
500 tons?
500 tons, and a ton, of course, is 2,000 pounds. Now, what's interesting about the triangular-shaped objects, Jeff, is that a lot of witnesses said this thing was like a mile in length. Now, granted, it's hard for a person to really make an accurate judgment as far as how big something is, but the bottom line is that these things were huge.
Well, 1,500 feet at night, Cal, flying at a relatively slow speed would look like a mile to me under the right circumstances. I think I understand this is an immense object.
Absolutely.
500-ton payload. Wow. All right. We're going to pause. They're called bistatic aerial surveillance platforms. Remarkable data. All right, we'll be right back with Kal Korf in just a couple minutes. We have callers holding, and we shall continue.
Welcome back to Sightings on the Radio.
Okay, back with Kal Korf. Let's take a couple calls now. Holding Roger in Spokane, listening in on KSBN. Thank you, Roger. You're on the air with Cal. Go ahead.
Yes, I've got a friend from California that wanted very much to find out how much time you had spent with Billy Meyer.
How much time I had spent with Billy Meyer?
Mm-hmm.
In what sense? Researching the case?
Well, how did you get Billy Meyer's side of the story?
I had arrangements to interview Mr. Meyer. He canceled the interview because the coup in the Soviet Union had gone down, and they had closed the borders to the Soviet Union at that time because nobody knew whether the Russians were going to go on the march or not, what the outcome of the coup was. And then Meyer canceled the interview because he went ahead and had to take the Russians back to their train station to get them back across the border in case they closed them again. I did interview everybody that spoke for Meyer and echoed his story, and then I would feed questions to Elizabeth Gruber and Simone, who would then run into Meyer's house, get his answer, and come out and answer my specific questions. And I did give several gifts to Billy Meyer, which he thanked me for, and I did see him, in the doorway of his house. The stories that came back to me when I was feeding the questions, all the answers were consistent entirely with all the different literature in the 14-odd books that have been published over the last 20 years on the Meyer case.
Well,
Roger, hold on. Let me suggest one thing. Are you online, Roger?
I'm sorry?
Are you online? Are you able to go on the internet?
No, I'm not.
Oh, okay. If you have a friend, on my page there is an archives listing under Real Audio, and I had Cal on and Randolph Winters do a 2-hour debate on both their views of what Billy Meyer is all about. It was a very good program. It was on May the 13th. If you can get to somebody who is online, and you can go hear that show anytime you'd like, I think it might be a real valuable source of information. I've had Randolph on by himself about Billy Meyer. I've had Cal on by himself about Billy Meyer, then brought both of them together, and it was a very good give and take. I think both people came across very well. So on May 13th, that's the program. It's in the Real Audio archives if you want to hear that. But I don't want to get too far off the subject tonight.
The one thing that I was concerned about is that this guy said that either this guy is just getting one side of the story, or he's just making it up, which I'd hate to think that that's what he's doing.
Well, I've read his book, and there's no way you can draw that conclusion if you simply read his book. I'm not here to tell you what,
This guy spent a long time with Billy Meyer.
Right.
And he knows what happened to him.
Well, you might want to contact, you might want to contact Cal off the air and discuss this with him further. I'd be happy to let you do that. If you want to give him a phone number, Cal, or an address, email, whatever. So he's not online, though, so maybe an address or something.
Okay. The address is 16625 Redmond Way. Again, that's 16625 Redmond Way, number 254. City is Redmond, state is Washington, 98052. And if you'll include your number, I'll be happy to call you, especially if we happen to live in the same state.
Okay, my main concern is that I hate to see things that come out that don't have anything but kind of like rumor or
right.
that
well,
sort of thing going.
We totally agree with you, Roger. That's why I do this show, and we try and pull as much information out of people as we can so you all can figure it out.
All right.
All right?
Thanks a lot.
You betcha.
Okay,
Thanks
bye.
for calling. Let's jump on to back up to the Everett, Seattle area. Gary is on the line. Hi, Gary. How are you?
Hi, Jeff. Doing good.
Good.
My question. Well, first of all, let me say I'm a eyewitness to the Black Triangle in '93, flying over Boeing, actually. Which was
really?
Yeah.
Right in Seattle. Well, that Cal is up in that neck of the woods, too. Did you find his description or what he read from the patent to be interesting to you?
Yeah, I found that really interesting. My first impressions as I was looking at it, what I did was I got out of the car as it passed directly overhead, and it was pretty low. So I sort of made a mental inventory of what I was looking at, and my first impression was I imagined myself standing at the top of the Kingdome inside watching a baseball game, and as if I was looking down on the field, it seemed to me this object would have filled the entire field. So, about the size of a football field, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, that's 300 feet, but the patent calls for up to 1,500 feet in length.
Yeah. Well, see, the thing was so huge that I didn't know.
Right.
But I guess my question is, this thing, I can't even say it was flying because it was more like it floated. It was so slow, and it was totally silent, and it was probably, I'm guessing, but maybe only about, less than 1,000 feet in the air, and I felt like it was about 500 feet in the air because as it passed over the main Boeing hangar that has the big checkerboards on it, Cal will know which one that is, it looked like only about one more height of the hangar would fit between the top of the hangar and the craft.
What time of day was this?
It was nighttime. It was about 9:30. There was a very, very high gray cloud cover that was sort of subtly lit by the city lights, which gave me a kind of a background to see this thing.
Gee.
It had one red light at each corner on the underside, flat up against it. And, here's my question again. Because of how slow it was and because it was totally silent, I'm wondering, does this indicate that we have anti-gravity technology? And if so, that could change the world.
Sure. Hang on.
The implications are astounding.
Exactly. Hold on a second, Gary. We'll be right back. And certainly there are a lot of reports of craft being able to be rigged to run totally silently with rather Earth-born technology. So we'll consider that as we continue here with Kal Korf in just a couple of minutes at Sightings on the Radio.
Welcome back to Sightings on the Radio.
Yeah, and just a couple of minutes left, I'm very sorry to say, but Gary's made a very interesting observation known to us. Cal, your response to it?
Well, I honestly don't know if we have anti-gravity. I know that the government, like a lot of private industry, has been searching for that particular pot of gold. But as you mentioned, Jeff, there are all kinds of ways to invoke noise cancellation, and you're seeing that more and more in use in ordinary consumer items and car engines as well as aircraft. But the reason I'd like to just mention one thing as we wrap this up. I can't prove that the V-shaped objects that were seen over Phoenix are government aircraft. As far as I'm concerned, the Phoenix UFOs that remain unexplained, and that include these black objects, are one of two things, either extraterrestrial or government. Because I can cross-examine the government issue, and I can't cross-examine the alien issue because I don't have aliens down here to, file Freedom of Information Act inquiries on, I am working with a small group of people who are going to be putting pressure on the government to try to get them to come clean about some of these devices and to try to clean up the UFO database and separate the signal from the noise. Now, I'm not out to violate national security because I believe very much in it, but I think our government can loosen up a little bit and say, hey, that was us. We don't need to know what it was, but just don't tell us we didn't see anything, because it produces a vicious cycle in our society. Right. It's very bad when the government says that wasn't us, which means by implication it must have not been from here, since we know it wasn't Russian or Chinese.
So just stop lying to us.
Exactly. So now that we know about some of these craft and we're getting some of the particulars, I'm going to be working with the major media and a lot of the media heavyweights in the newspaper industry to put pressure on the government to come clean about some of this stuff. And if it turns out it's Uncle Sam, that's fine. If we eliminate Uncle Sam as a culprit or a cause, then what we have left are extraterrestrial. So I'm excited about this opportunity because through process of elimination, hopefully, once this exploration runs its course, we may, for the first time in the UFO field, have some decent, solid answers.
Yeah.
As long as we can get some of those, or we have a chance to, I feel morally obligated as a UFO researcher to go after some of these answers if we can at all possibly, obtain them.
Well, you're not going to get any argument out of me. We need some real truth here. It's getting to be a little silly. Gary, we have to run. I'm sorry. Thanks very much for the call.
Thanks for the invitation.
You're very. But before you run, you've seen something that would have blown my mind. That's.
It in a way changed my life, Jeff.
Yeah, I buy that. To go back, thanks, Gary.
Yeah.
To go back again to that patent that Cal was reading from in 1990. A patent was granted for a flying device called a bistatic aerial surveillance platform by the patent seeker, 1,500 feet long, 200 feet thick, with a 500-ton projected payload. Factor that together, paint it black, fly it around at night. Wow, and you've got something that'll really it'll stand a lot of hair on end, I'd say.
Yeah, in fact, that's not the only such craft, Jeff. I also have a newspaper clipping from the San Jose Mercury from 1990 talking about everything from these stealth blimps to, again, triangular-shaped aircraft. And what we are seeing, especially like in Australia for last year, of all the daytime UFO reports, the black triangles outnumbered saucer-shaped reports by 2 to 1. And I believe that these black triangles are government-made, or we've got a heck of a coincidence going on in that aliens happen to be building what our Star Wars programs are building. And
very interesting.
That, to me, is a little too cozy.
Yeah. All right, Cal, thanks for the update. Keep us posted. We appreciate it, and we'll talk again soon.
Okay, thanks a lot, Jeff.
You bet. Another program down in the archives for you to listen to anytime you'd like. Just go to our site and go into Real Audio, and you can hear these things. It's amazing to me, the technology, but it's there. It's like a living library of radio shows. So, until next time, that's tomorrow night. Jeff Rense, thanking you once again for being with me tonight. I'll be back tomorrow. Until then, have yourselves a great night, and good luck.